Today, we will talk about the H-2A program as a strategy for securing and managing agricultural labor. My name is Margarita Velandia, and I'm a professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of Tennessee. I will cover some information about the use of the H-2A program in Tennessee with Jane Chadwell, Executive Director at Gap Connections, and Amy Rotchkes, Training and Resource Coordinator at Gap Connections. Jane and Amy have several years of experience working with farmers using the H-2A program. The training will be divided into 4 sections. We'll briefly talk about trends related to agricultural labor in Tennessee. Then we will talk about the H-2A program, farm labor contractors, and finally, we will talk about best labor management practices. Let's talk about agricultural labor trends specifically related to the H-2A program. One of the indicators of labor challenges farm businesses are facing, specifically those related to labor scarcity, is the fact that the number of H-2A positions requested and approved have increased more than sevenfold in the past 17 years, from just over 48,000 positions certified in fiscal year 2005 to around 371,000 in fiscal year 2022, as you can see in this graph. And this is regardless of the fact the cost associated with using the program has increased over time, not only the processing cost, but the minimum wages you are required to pay these workers. We'll talk about the H-2A program in detail later on. Still, for now, you need to understand that H-2A positions are those requested through the H-2A program, requesting workers from other countries for agricultural jobs on a seasonal basis. Following national trends, data about the H-2A program in Tennessee is also an indicator of farm labor scarcity in Tennessee. In Tennessee, the U.S. Department of Labor certified 6,556 temporary jobs under the H-2A visa program in fiscal year 2023. This is a 103% increase from the 3,224 temporary jobs certified in Tennessee under the H-2A visa program in fiscal year 2016. Visas are not issued for every certified job. On average, between fiscal years 2016 and 2022, 76% of certified jobs under the H-2A program resulted in the issuance of a visa to the United States. The graph on the right shows the adverse effect wage rate, a minimum hourly wage rate employers of the H-2A workers must offer and pay. The adverse effect wage rate has increased on average of 4% per year, with an increase of 6% between fiscal years 2023 and 2024. As you can see in this slide, the number of certifications and therefore labor requests have increased over time, regardless of the cost of hiring these types of workers. This is another evidence of labor shortages. In this section, we're going to cover various aspects of the H-2A program, including what it is, the process to obtain workers through the H-2A program, the use of the program in Tennessee, and specifically in counties with a high concentration of row crop production and cost of using the program. The H-2A Temporary Agricultural Program, also called the H-2A Visa Program, is a program that allows U.S. agricultural employers experiencing a shortage of domestic workers to fill seasonal or temporary jobs with foreign non-immigrant workers. The employment has to be seasonal or temporary in nature, implying that the work is tied to a specific time of the year when required labor is above the regular operation needs. For example, the harvesting of crops is seasonal in nature and requires higher labor levels than in other activities related to the crop's growing cycle. To protect U.S. workers from adverse effects on their wages resulting from hiring foreign workers, the U.S. Department of Labor established a minimum hourly wage rate that employers of H-2A workers must offer and pay. This is called the adverse effect wage rate. An employer seeking to employ H-2A workers is required to pay a wage at least equal to the adverse effect wage rate if this is the highest applicable rate for the job offered by the employer. Employers must guarantee to offer each worker employment for a total number of hours equal to at least 75% of the workdays in the contract period. This is what we called the 3/4 guaranteed. For example, if a contract is for a 10-week period during which a normal work week is specified as 6 days a week, 8 hours per day, the worker would need to be guaranteed employment for at least 360 hours. This is 10 weeks times 48 hours per week, which is equivalent to 480 hours, multiplied by 75%. That's how I come up with my 360 hours. Employers must provide housing at no cost to H-2A workers. If the employer decides to secure rental or public accommodations for such workers, the employer is required to pay all housing-related charges directly to the housing manager. For example, the cost of putting workers in a hotel. In addition, employers are required to either provide each covered worker with 3 meals per day at no more than the Department of Labor specified cost, or to furnish free and convenient cooking and kitchen facilities where workers can prepare their own meals. Employers must provide daily transportation between the workers' living quarters and the employer's worksite at no cost. Employer-provided transportation must meet all applicable safety standards, be properly insured, and be operated by licensed drivers. If not previously advanced or otherwise provided, the employer must reimburse workers for reasonable costs incurred for inbound transportation and subsistence costs once the worker completes 50% of the work contract period. Upon completion of the work contract, the employer must either provide or pay for the worker's return transportation and daily subsistence during travel. Employers must keep accurate records of the number of hours of work offered each day by the employer and the hours actually worked each day by the worker. H-2A workers in Tennessee are employed in counties with a large percentage of labor-intensive crop production. In fiscal year 2023, the top 10 counties representing more than 70% of the total H-2A certifications were Rhea, Robertson, Cook, Warren, Macon, Washington, Bledsoe, Henry, Montgomery, and Lincoln, each of them with anywhere between 200 and 1,109 certified jobs. The information presented in this map is useful as you can identify farms in your county that have already used the program, which could give you information about their experience with the program and can recommend reliable companies that have helped them bring H-2A workers to their businesses. When you compare the fiscal year 2022 and 2023, you can see an increase in the use of H-2A workers in some counties located in West Tennessee. In this slide, I'm showing the number of certified H-2A workers in fiscal years 2022 and 2023 in selected counties in West Tennessee that traditionally have a large percentage of acreage in row crop production, specifically soybeans and corn production. In most of these counties, the number of H-2A workers requested has increased. Nonetheless, it is important to note that only a few of the operations in these counties requesting H-2A workers are row crop operations. For example, in Gibson County, we have one row crop operation that obtained certification for 2 H-2A workers in fiscal year 2023. It seems row crop operations tend to request a small number of H-2A workers. As you will see later on this training, this has implications for workers' housing options and processing costs. The U.S. Department of Labor is in charge of certifying all H-2A temporary positions, although the employer could complete the certification process. In Tennessee, a large percentage of the petitions or worker certifications are handled by a firm or business specializing in H-2A worker applications. These businesses or law firms complete the certification process on behalf of the employer. These businesses or firms charge a fee for their services. In fiscal year 2022, about 88% of the certified jobs in Tennessee were handled by an agent. This table presents the top 8 business or firms in terms of certified jobs used by Tennessee employers to handle H-2A job certifications in fiscal years 2022 and 2023. An employer should conduct their research before using an attorney, agent, or H-2A labor contractor to handle the certification and hiring process. We're now going to talk about the cost of using the H-2A program. An example of the estimated employer costs associated with sourcing workers through the H-2A program in fiscal year 2023 is listed on this table for an employer requesting 4 workers. Costs presented in this table were estimated using information from 5 operations in Tennessee using the H-2A program in fiscal year 2023. These costs include application, filing, consulate, border stamp, and agent fees. Additionally, there are costs associated with the transportation of workers from and to their home country and transportation for travel to and from the grocery store and bank. Employers should provide housing for workers, which is an additional cost for employers. Other costs include workers' compensation, house and vehicle insurance, house repairs, and house water testing as part of the housing requirements. Labor certification, non-immigrant worker petition filing, visa application, and border stamp fees are the same regardless of the operation. In contrast, agent fee, inbound, outbound, and daily transportation, worker compensations, and housing will vary greatly from operation to operation, depending on very many factors. Let's talk specifically about agent fees. As mentioned before, agent fees are paid to authorize individuals and businesses that complete the necessary documentation and help complete the certification process on behalf of the employer. According to the data that we collected, these fees could be anywhere between $400 and $600 per worker, depending on the agent. These costs could be higher depending on the agent, business, or lawyer you're working with. Regarding transportation and travel costs, there are costs associated with workers traveling from their home country to their work site and back to their country, including transportation and subsistence costs. There are also costs associated with workers' transportation for traveling to and from the living quarters, the grocery store, and the bank. These costs will vary depending on the worker's country of origin, mode of transportation, distance to the grocery store and bank, and distance from the living quarters to the work site. Regarding workers' compensation, there are workers' compensation costs associated with employing H-2A workers. These costs will vary greatly depending on the type of work performed by workers and the type of crops workers are working with. In terms of housing costs, if the employer decides to secure rental accommodations such as apartment, hotels, or motels, the employer is required to pay all housing-related charges directly to the housing's management. Housing costs include repair, water testing, and utilities if the employer is providing housing on site instead of securing rental accommodations. In Tennessee, the type of housing provided by employers to H-2A workers varies greatly depending on the number of workers. Examples of housing types used in Tennessee include mobile homes, wood frame bunk houses, trailers, metal frame houses, single-family houses, hotels, motels, and apartments. For example, a farmer in Tennessee employing 4 H-2A workers indicated that a wood frame 12 by 28 portable building housing for 4 workers could cost about $25,000. The estimated repair cost at $500 per year and water testing at anywhere between $150 and $200 per year. Another farmer estimated housing costs at $1,000 per worker per month. The U.S. Department of Agriculture estimates that housing costs are around $9,000 to $13,000 per worker, which seems to be a little bit high. It is unclear if this cost includes investment costs as well as utility and repair costs. Housing will be the highest expense for employers. Regarding taxes, workers under the H-2A program are exempt from U.S. Social Security and Medicare taxes on compensations paid to them for work or services provided under this program. There are other unique tax implications for workers and employers under the H-2A program that should be consulted with an accountant. Another cost you must consider when hiring H-2A workers is the hourly rate. The adverse effect wage rate is adjusted yearly using wage data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture Farm Labor Survey. The figure on this slide shows the Tennessee adverse effect wage rate from 2016 to 2024. You can see that the adverse effect wage rate has increased over time and is likely to keep increasing. The map on the right shows the adverse effect of the adverse effect wage rate for 2024 in all states. As you can see in this map, Tennessee is one of the states with the lowest adverse effect wage rate. This rate varies by state and is not surprising that West Coast states have the highest rate, which is close to $20 per hour. The U.S. Department of Labor published a final rule in February of 2023 describing a new methodology for determining the adverse effect wage rate that was implemented on March 30th of 2023. That is for certain occupations for temporary labor certification in the H-2A program. This new methodology uses a combination of wage data reported by the Farm Labor Survey and the Department's Bureau of Labor Statistics Occupational Employment and Wage Statistics Survey. This final rule affects employers who seek to employ H-2A workers in jobs that are outside of the standard occupational classification codes for field and livestock workers that I'm listing on this slide. Examples of jobs affected by the rule include worker supervision, and jobs that entail driving duties depending on the type of equipment involved and the location of the work. More information about the 2023 Adverse Effect Wage Rate Final Rule can be found at the link provided in the last bullet point on this slide. In this slide, I'm showing the number of certified H-2A workers in Tennessee by Standard Occupation Code. The majority of workers fall under the farm workers and laborer category, which will not be affected by the final rule. Nonetheless, we have a few workers in other categories, such as construction workers, heavy and tractor trailer truck drivers, and first-line supervisors. An agent helping you with the application process will be able to guide you on the best strategy to submit the application so that you can comply with the final rule. Now we're going to switch gears, and Jane is going to continue talking about farm labor contractors. Jane?
All right, let's talk about farm labor contractors. You'll go to the next slide. A farm labor contractor, known as an FLC, is someone who receives compensation in return for providing any of the following services to migrant and/or seasonal agricultural workers. Migrant workers are workers who cannot return to their permanent home each night after work, and seasonal workers are any worker that is not employed all year round. Those services include furnishing, providing workers as needed or wanted, recruiting, the process of attracting or selecting someone for a job, employing, giving work to somebody, soliciting, asking for or trying to obtain someone to work, hiring, employing someone to work for wages, transporting, driving workers to and from the field, or housing, providing housing that complies with federal and state safety and health standards to workers. Compensation could be in cash, a percentage of a crop, a percentage of payroll, but no matter the form, if they are benefiting from providing these services monetarily, they are an FLC. You see from the image at the bottom of the screen that the FLC is the middleman between the farmers and the workers. Next slide. So a little Q&A. The question is, a farmer uses a crew leader to provide his labor. Is that the same as a farm labor contractor? It is common we hear terms such as crew leader, crew boss, that guy who I ask to bring some workers when I need them. But the important thing to remember is even if they don't say they are a farm labor contractor, but they hire, solicit, recruit, transport any worker on behalf of a farmer for a fee, they are considered a farm labor contractor by the U.S. Department of Labor. To note, if you, the farmer, or one of your employees are doing these activities, you or the employee do not have to register as an FLC. This only applies to those third-party or independent contractors who are not employees. Next slide. Now we are going to talk about two types of farm labor contractors. On the left-hand side, we have a normal farm labor contractor, and on the right, we have what we call an H-2A. If you'll click. A farm labor contractor uses non-H-2A labor, such as migrant or local workers, to create his or her crew, whereas an H-2A uses H-2A labor to create his or her crew. This means that the H-2A applies for workers much like a farmer would be applying for H-2A workers, but the H-2A can move with the workers from farm to farm. So they're both FLCs, just different labor sources. Next. The most important obligation and requirement of an FLC or an H-2A is that they have to be registered, meaning they have a Farm Labor Contractor Certificate of Registration. The Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Worker Protection Act, MISPA, requires an FLC to obtain a federal certificate of registration prior to performing any farm labor contracting activities. They get the certificate by applying through the U.S. Department of Labor, and once they have that certificate, they must keep their FLC certificate or card on them at all times. If they are housing workers, transporting workers, meaning they are responsible for the vehicles that workers will be transported in, or driving workers, that they will actually be the one behind the wheel driving the workers, they must be authorized to do those activities, and it will be listed on their certificate. If they are authorized to house, they must have a current housing inspection certificate for each housing facility. If they are authorized to transport, then all vehicles used will be included on that FLC certification card. All vehicles used will have to have current tags and inspections, and they must have insurance, both auto and workers' comp, for each vehicle. If they are authorized to drive, they must have a doctor's certification. This states that they are physically able to drive an automobile and have a valid driver's license. They cannot house, transport, or drive workers if they are not authorized to do so. Next. If they are an H-2A and bring in H-2A workers, they must also have a contract with a grower or farmer, and obtain a surety bond that covers liability incurred during the term of the work contract period listed on the H-2A application, and must remain in effect for a period of at least 2 years from the expiration date of the labor certification. An H-2A cannot just show up on farms unless they are listed on their application and have a contract with the H-2A when the H-2A applies for workers. This means they have to have a plan and arrangements made ahead of them applying for workers. This also means as a farmer, you cannot have an H-2A bring their crew of workers to work on your farm unless you have had a contract with them prior to them applying for those workers. The workers can only work at the locations listed on the H-2A application. Next. Here are some examples of a farm labor contractor certificate of registration. They list their FLC number, their social security number or the last 4 digits, their name, and their authorizations. With both of these examples, you'll see circled in red that they are not authorized to do any of those services we mentioned: housing, transporting, or driving. Good questions when you come across an FLC with no authorizations or less than those three authorizations is to ask them where the workers live, who will be driving them to your farm, and who is responsible for the vehicles. The answer may be the worker themselves, as they could live local. But if it is someone else, then that person may need to be registered as a farm labor contractor. Next. So if you have their license, if you know their name, you can look them up. The U.S. Department of Labor has a list of registered FLCs, and you can verify that they have an active certificate and what their authorizations are. They also have a debarred list with FLCs that have found to have violations and been disbarred from being a farm labor contractor. You will want to make sure the FLC you want to work with is listed on the good list and not the bad list. Next. Here's a list of FLCs in Tennessee. However, most FLCs may register in one state but travel to multiple. So just because there may only be a handful listed in Tennessee does not mean there are not more operating in Tennessee. Next. Over the last decade, the number of farm labor contractors have increased, especially in the H-2A program. A report done by the Economic Research Service at USDA looked at this trend and found that more than half of the recent growth in H-2A certifications comes from FLCs. So the FLC share of H-2A jobs increased from 13% in 2007 to 44% in 2020. This chart demonstrates the increase in the number of H-2A workers working for an FLC in comparison to individual employers such as farmers and associations such as AWMA or others that Margarita mentioned earlier. The light blue line is the total number of H-2A workers certified for direct employers such as farmers. The brown or tan line is the number of H-2A workers certified for H-2A-LCs. From this chart, you can also see that many FLCs based in one state employ H-2A workers in other states. Over 1/3 of all FLC H-2A employment was contracted for out-of-state employers and work sites. The orange line is those H-2A-LCs with workers working in only the state they registered in, and the green line is those H-2A-LCs that have workers working in other states. Next. So if you are considering using a farm labor contractor, you and the FLC you will be working with should review the US DOL publication, Cultivating Compliance, Your Next Steps as a Registered Farm Labor Contractor. To find this, just Google DOL WH1021. That is the publication number, and it should pop up. This publication will walk each of you through all of the obligations of an FLC. Next. One important consideration when working with an FLC we haven't talked about yet is joint employment. Joint employment means that an individual is employed by two or more persons at the same time. So how can one determine if joint employment exists? The ultimate question is whether the agricultural work is economically dependent upon more than one person. So why does joint employment matter when you're working with a farm labor contractor? Where a joint employment relationship exists, each of the employers must ensure that the employee receives all employment legal rights. This means that both parties may be held liable if either party fails to comply with the law. For example, if you're working with a farm labor contractor and the arrangement is the farm labor contract totals the hours and wages and says you owe X amount for all of the work. You write a check to the FLC and assume that they will pay everyone accordingly. But what if they don't? If the US DOL determines you are a joint employer with the FLC, you will also be responsible for any back wages or mispayment of the workers. Next. So due to the potential of joint employment liability you may have when working with the farm labor contractor you want to verify all that you can. This includes the certificate of registration and all the authorizations such as housing, transporting, and driving. You also want to make sure that they're providing terms and conditions of the job to each employee as required by MISPA. that they are keeping accurate time and payroll records and providing a wage statement to each worker required by MISPA and the Fair Labor Standards Act, and that they have completed I-9 records for all workers, and that you can check their ages to make sure there are no underage or minor workers working on your farm, especially if hazardous tasks are involved. FLCs who have been doing this work for years should have examples to show you, even if they have not started the work this year, or being able to explain their processes with paperwork and documentation. Also consider checking references of any FLC you are considering hiring, and even do a Google search for their name to see if there are any press releases or stories about violations associated with them. And consider paying all the workers directly to ensure accurate and timely payment of wages and taxes, removing the risk of that third party making a mistake without you knowing. Next. Even if you are not concerned about being deemed a joint employer with a farm labor contractor, if that farm labor contractor is found to have committed some violation or be found to owe money or civil penalties according to the USDOL, there still could be a press release that is released by the Department of Labor. In this release, the names of the farms that work with that farm labor contractor may be named. So maybe you're not facing the same penalties or violations that the farm labor contractor is because you are not deemed a joint employer, but your name or your brand could be hurt by working with someone who has skirted the laws and regulations. This may be something an existing or potential buyer will not find attractive, and you may be labeled as a risky supplier. Next. We also, in recent times, because of the increasing number of H-2A that are being used across the country, have started seeing more severe cases that involve more than just not paying the workers correctly, but charges that amount to human trafficking. Blooming Onion was a big case in Georgia in 2021 that involved a number of federal agencies, including the FBI. The H-2A was exploiting workers by having them dig onions with their bare hands, paying them 20 cents for each bucket harvested, and threatening them with guns and violence to keep them in line. This case also had workers die because of these working conditions. This case ended in huge fines and penalties and jail time for many who were involved. Stories like this make you stop and think about who you may be deemed a joint employer with. Farmers who have been caught up in egregious violations knowingly or unknowingly with FLCs will tell you, if you think it's a bad day to have the USDOL show up on your farm, it's an even worse day to have the FBI show up. Next. Because there have been more investigations that have linked FLCs to human trafficking in recent times, it is important to make sure you understand what human trafficking is. I think a lot of people who think of human trafficking think about the movie Taken or unsavory behavior at a truck stop or motels. But human trafficking is not limited to sexual trafficking. There is also labor trafficking. Labor trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, debt bondage, or slavery. So basically having someone forced or coerced into working for little or no pay. Make sure you are familiar with the signs of human trafficking, including appearing malnourished or abused, no control of their personal documents. This is a big one. They have to have access to their passport or visas at all times. If they don't, that is a red flag, as someone could be holding them to keep them there. Little to no pay, working to pay off a debt. These workers could be getting paid, but are having to pay someone back a large sum of money, amounting to working for nothing. Threats to report workers to immigration services, saying, if you don't work, I'm going to call ICE on you. Well, we tell farmers, if they are suspicious, try to talk to some of the workers. Ask them where they stay each night, where they have worked before this farm, and are they getting paid? Any dialogue that may open the door. Also, sometimes if someone steps in and says, don't talk to these workers, you can view that as a red flag. So be familiar with what you can do to help, including providing the National Human Trafficking Hotline to suspected victims or calling yourself. Next. Bottom line, there are some really good farm labor contractors out there. but you must know who you are in business with and manage the risk by using best practices and due diligence to verify the FLC or H-2A is following the law and treating their workers well in accordance with their worker rights. And now I'm going to turn it over to Amy Roachkus.
Thanks, Jane. I'm going to cover best practices for labor management, including record keeping, communication, and policies. Next slide. When I think about records and record keeping, I also think about it being equal to risk management. Farmers, growers, farm operations buy insurance, whether it's farm, liability, or crop insurance policies to manage risks. And so good record keeping and good documentation is a way to manage risk associated with labor management incidences or allegations. Next slide. There are some common record keeping problems that have been noted by the U.S. Department of Labor investigators. One of those being workers not given full disclosure in writing. We think about disclosure also as the terms and conditions of employment or the job description. The second common problem, no record of hours worked when being paid a piece rate. So even if you're paying a piece rate, you have to record, or the workers should record their hours, their start time and their end time, their hours worked. The third common problem, not all hours worked being recorded, again, either by the employee or by the employer, and those hours not being paid. The fourth common problem is illegal deductions. So anything being deducted from a worker's wage statement should be disclosed in that job description or terms and conditions of employment. Things that can be considered illegal deductions might be charges for gas in vehicles that they're using on the farm, or possibly fees for having uniforms that they would wear for work hours. The next common problem, workers don't receive complete wage statements each period. So keep in mind, the U.S. Department of Labor has a wage statement template, and that template has all the required parts to be in compliance with the Migrant Seasonal Worker Protection Act and the H-2A program. The next common problem, not accurately recording hours offered. This is specifically needing to be in compliance with H-2A program rules. It is important that the employer document the hours offered to the workers or the employees. That helps the employer meet their 3-quarter guarantee during their contract. The next common problem, agricultural employers not maintaining copies of the FLC and the H-2A LC records, not maintaining accurate, detailed recruiting documents, this again specifically for the H-2A program, and then finally, not accurately completing and maintaining the required Form I-9 documents. Next slide. So what are some labor records that you should be keeping in order to be in compliance, again, with MISPA, the H-2A program, and even the Fair Labor Standards Act? The first one is the terms and conditions of employment. You'll also have us refer to that as their job description or their disclosure statement. The U.S. Department of Labor has a wage and hour template. It's WH-516 that details, what is the place of employment? Where is it? Where do they show up every day? What is their start date? What is their end date? What are they being paid? Are they being paid a piece rate? Are there any deductions? Are there any benefits? Again, it's the job description. The wage statement, again, being in compliance with MISPA and H-2A, it's important that you as the employer maintain a copy of the wage statement and that you provide a copy to the worker. Hours offered. Again, for the H-2A program, you have in your contract hours that you believe you're going to use these workers, and you're offering those workers so many hours, so you should document hours offered to help you meet your contract guarantee. And then finally, the Form I-9s. Next slide, please. So Jane did an excellent job covering FLCs, FLCEs, and the H-2A LCs. But when you think about records that you need to keep in your operation files, this is a pretty extensive list. Jane shared a copy of what that certificate of registration looks like. You should have a valid copy in your farm files, along with a copy of the workers' compensation insurance, a copy of the terms and conditions of employment. If the farm labor contractor or the H-2A is authorized to house and authorized to drive or transport, you should have pre-occupancy housing inspections, vehicle registrations, insurances and inspections, and copies of the driver's license, and if applicable, a doctor's certificate. Again, that is the wage and hour 515 form for anyone that is driving and transporting. If you are not paying the workers through the farm labor contractor or the H-2A LC directly, again, make sure you get copies of their payroll records. That is your insurance that those workers are being paid by the farm labor contractor or the H-2A LC. Have copies of the W-2s from each season and get proof of payment for all the employment taxes. Next slide, please. If you're using an H-2A contractor, you have to, or you should have copies of all of those records I talked about on the previous slide. Plus, you should have a copy of the surety bond. You should have a copy of the contract between yourself and the H-2A LC. You should have copies of the ETA 790 and ETA 790A and the ETA 9142. As Jane mentioned, the H-2A LC cannot get their certificate of registration from USDOL without having copies of the surety bond and the contract. And again, you want to make sure your farming operation, your name, is listed on those ETA documents. Next slide, please. Some additional records that you may want to keep or need to keep, whether you're using local labor, migrant labor, or the H-2A program. Vehicle inspection reports, vehicles that workers are being transported in or driving. Auto insurance. Valid driver's license for all the drivers. I mentioned that doctor certificate. It is a USDOL wage and hour 515 form. The housing inspection reports and the housing terms and conditions. Another U.S. Department of Labor wage and hour form is the 521. Next slide, please. Just want to cover a few tips for record keeping. Know which records you need to keep to be in compliance. Record everything accurately. Your records should be organized and complete. I hear from growers that have had a DOL investigation that know, being organized and having everything ready to go is one step in success of going through that investigation. And then finally, don't procrastinate. Don't wait till the last minute. Set aside time every day or every week to keep your records up to date. Next slide, please. So next I'm going to talk about effective communication. Strong employer-employee relations in agriculture are built on a foundation of trust and collaboration. When employers prioritize open communication, respect, and mutual understanding, it creates an environment where employees feel valued. It also creates an environment where there is increased productivity. It allows that employee to offer suggestions for job improvement and work improvement. And then finally, ensure you as the employer are doing all that you can do to stay compliant. Next slide, please. So create a working environment where the employees are comfortable voicing their concerns without a negative reaction or retaliation. Regular communication is always the best practice. And, it's as easy as telling workers, my door is always open. You can come and talk to me. Or here is my cell phone number. Here is my email address. Text me, call me, email me. One of the best things that I like to see is employers having daily or weekly meetings with their farm employees. And it can be as simple as, in passing, showing verbal gratitude, saying thanks, talking about here is the work plan for the day, here is the work plan for the week. It's also gives you the opportunity to talk about job improvement. What can be done better? What should we be doing to make the job easier? What can we do to be more efficient? And it's your opportunity to ask those open-ended questions. Do you have questions? Do you have concerns? One of the best examples I have from a farm is a tobacco grower in North Carolina has over 100 H-2A workers, but every morning at 7 a.m. or whatever time they are starting, he starts with a daily meeting. And it's his way to communicate and talk with the crew about who's doing what work, what jobs need to be done, what is happening on the farm. But it's his point of contact with those workers. And then finally, we all know the golden rule. Be kind, be respectful. Next slide, please. Another best management practice is on the first day of the job for workers. It's good to set aside some time for an orientation to the farm and what we like to call onboarding. It's time to complete the required paperwork, the Form I-9, applying for a Social Security number if they don't have it, filling out the W-2 tax form. The second part of that orientation really is about communicating and talking to the workers so that they have an understanding of their expectations and what is there for them. So it's a time to communicate and talk about the terms and conditions of employment, the job description. It's a great opportunity to give the workers a sample of a wage statement and walk them through so they understand how to read and understand what is in their wage statement. If you have policies in place for the farm, and we strongly recommend some of these policies I'm going to cover, but it's a time to communicate and share copies of those policies. The anti-discrimination policy, a disciplinary policy, and a no retaliation policy. The orientation and onboarding time is also an opportunity to discuss the farm emergency plan. What should workers do in case there is a chemical spill, in case there is a fire, in case there is a need to have emergency services come to the farm. And I think back to 2021 or 2022 when the tornadoes hit Western Kentucky. So many of our tobacco growers still had workers on the farm, and they shared stories of their workers knowing what they needed to do because of having a farm emergency plan. Some of the other things, if you're providing housing, it's a good opportunity to communicate your rules and expectations of housing, review the occupancy terms and conditions, and if you provide transportation, to go over the rules and expectations of the vehicles that are available to workers to use. Next slide, please. So let's talk about a disciplinary policy. It is important to have a disciplinary policy which has steps. So I think about step one being first warning. It's a verbal warning with discussion about a corrective action. Step 2 is a second warning. It's again some counseling, maybe putting together a corrective action plan, and it's an official written warning that's going to go in the employee's folder. The third step is a third warning. This, is getting to a level where there's some disciplinary procedures and policies that need to be put into place, but really laying some things out with the employee. And then finally is the final written warning, which can lead up to suspension or termination. Again, during your onboarding and orientation process, it is important to review and provide those workers a copy of this policy. You also want to make sure that you use the same policy for all your employees. You're using the same policy for a local employee and a migrant employee and an H-2A employee. Each employee should be treated the same to avoid any claims of discrimination or retaliation. Next slide, please. So can an employer, especially a farmer, experience or document performance issues? And you can. You can document and use disciplinary policy for employee misconduct, fighting, harassment or bullying, drug or alcohol use, attendance issues, and obviously inadequate performance. Next slide, please. One of the biggest things is to address worker issues and concerns immediately. I know it's very busy on the farm, and sometimes it's very easy to, witness something going on, but just turn and walk away, or turn a blind eye to it. But it is very important to address it when it happens. So, if a worker does something on the farm, provide the proper discipline. Make sure that the worker understands the disciplinary measures. And again, keeping in mind, there may be that language barrier there. You need to break down and communicate in a language that the worker understands. Provide corrective action as described again in the disciplinary policy and the terms and conditions of employment. And, if a worker does express a concern, you don't want to threaten, intimidate, or even retaliate against that worker. Next slide. So I have mentioned retaliation a couple times. So what is retaliation? Retaliation is defined as any kind of negative action against a current or a former employee that takes the form of punishment or creates a hostile, threatening, or uncomfortable environment because of their report. Retaliation can be expressed in a variety of ways. It can be harassment, it can be termination, it can be reduction of pay hours or hours offered to work or benefits. It can be even excluding the employee from some job duties or tasks. Next slide, please. So one of those other policies we do recommend is a retaliation policy. You want to create a retaliation policy to ensure disciplinary policies are not used in a retaliatory manner. Make sure your employees know how to communicate problems to you and that they do not need to fear any reprisal. So a lot of times, one of the examples we get from growers is to have a suggestion or a comment box. It's, anonymous. The worker can write down, what they're experiencing or what they witnessed, and then you have a way to take care of it and address it. Employees do have the right to communicate their problems, make suggestions, or even, disclose issues. Employees that file complaints with an employer or even a government agency are protected under federal law. So again, it is important that employers benefit, it's to the employer's benefit to resolve issues as soon as they come up and to avoid any retaliatory behavior. Next slide, please. So when it gets down to it, again, I talked about documents and records being your risk management tool. Document, document, document. When there is evidence or suspicion of misconduct, the employer should investigate the matter and document the findings. Document the nature of the events, and if you know the employees or you need to talk with the employees, you need to explain to the employees the nature of the events. Document every step of the disciplinary process, including the employee's response and steps toward improvement, those corrective actions I talked about. The employee should read and sign the written reprimand and read and sign the final written warning. Again, that's going to go in the employee file and kept and maintained on the farm. The document should include the time frame in which the employee must correct their conduct. Next slide. Thank you for joining us today. For more information on our labor management, we do have a website at gapconnections.com. What we do, labor management.